Good afternoon, everyone. At least good afternoon for those of you in the Central and Eastern time zones. Welcome to our webinar on surviving catastrophic events. We're glad you can join us. This is Chip Magid. I'm a partner in Dorsey's Washington, D.C. office, and I'd like to introduce you to my co-presenters today. Jocelyn Knoll is my partner at Dorsey Whitney and has particular expertise in construction and design law. And Bob McNaney is Vice President of Crisis and Critical Issues at PadillaCRT, a national communications firm. Bob can give us information from both sides of the ledger, having served in a distinguished career in the media and now advises executives and corporations on how to deal with issues in the media. I thought we'd begin today with talking about some of the real-world examples that affect particularly those of you in the energy industry and the utility industry. And let me just mention before we get into that, as you have questions as we go through here, we do not have live chat, but we do have live email capability. And our email address here in the control room is DorseyU, that's D-O-R-S-E-Y-U, at Dorsey, D-O-R-S-E-Y.com. And we'll take your questions and we'll get to them as we do our presentation. Many of you, you may not be familiar with this particularly grainy photograph, but this is a cell phone photo taken by a fisherman in the Gulf of Mexico as the Deepwater Horizon drilling rig exploded. And because this is particularly newsworthy and has been well explored, we don't have to go into the particular details of that. But again, here is an instance of an issue that was unexpected, happened suddenly, had profound consequences not only for the people in the Gulf region, but also for BP in particular, which is found it to be an expensive and embarrassing incident. Now we're going to show you another incident that occurred just outside San Francisco.
Anne-Marie Chirambero suffered second-degree burns on her hands and chest as she and her family escaped the huge gas pipeline explosion.
Sheer panic. We didn't even have time to think to grab anything. I was barefoot, we just wanted to get out of there as soon as possible.
Anne-Marie and her father, who was burned on his head and arm, were at a meeting for those not yet allowed back into the neighborhood. Their home is damaged, but still livable.
It'll be creepy going back to move and live, in a destroyed neighborhood. But, hopefully it'll get back to normal eventually.
But some here don't have a home to go back to.
I know it's history. I know it's gone because I know it's like three houses away from Brownsville. Our house was the third house to go up in the flames.
PG&E announced Monday it was establishing a $100 million victims fund.
I realize money can't return lives. Can't heal scars, can't replace memories. But there does come a time for healing and for rebuilding.
I've been there 45 years, so I've lost, not only have neighbors that have lost their homes, I have neighbors that have lost their lives. So it's very traumatic.
Federal investigators probing why the line ruptured, crated up the pipeline segment and sent it to Washington, D.C. for further examination. Haven Daily, The Associated Press, San Bruno, California.
All right, before we go to satellite imagery, Bob, maybe you could offer a few comments about the PG&E situation.
Yeah, Chip, thanks. And again, good afternoon, good morning, depending on where you are as you're listening to this. It's an interesting situation because it's one that this industry in particular can see. You wake up in the morning, and before you know it, you have a neighborhood that's in flames. No one expects it to happen, but being prepared to react is critically important. And we saw some really strong moments there. And one of the things that we can take away from this example is our theory of always walk toward the crisis.
What do you mean by that?
Walk toward it. Take responsibility. Don't be the head in the sand kind of company. You had a situation where you had your CEO, Chris Johns, on scene, dressed appropriately, in the firehouse, talking about people, talking about compassion, not talking about the specific elements of the explosion, because frankly in the early stages of a crisis you don't have great information. Your job there is to basically stand up and say, we're sorry, We're going to work to figure out what happened. We're going to work to make people whole. The next key moment is the concept of words and actions. You can say all this. You can be a great actor. But the $100 million that the company puts up is that concept of we're going to say we're going to do the right thing and we're going to do it. And you do it early. The early stages of a crisis like this is critically important. So you had words, actions, response, executives on the ground who were clearly properly trained to deal with communications, and we'll talk more about that throughout this webcast. But being able to communicate not only to the media, but through the media to your community, your regulators, your customers is critically important. They did a great job overall on that.
Right, and Jocelyn, I know that you've been involved with a number of high-profile crises. One that comes to mind is the collapse of the Interstate 35W bridge in downtown Minneapolis and countless others. I know you speak often about paying attention to the human factor. Can you expound on that a little bit?
Sure. Good afternoon, good morning, everyone. Looking at a situation like the 35W bridge collapse, where you have an interstate collapse of a bridge over the Mississippi on a hot summer evening during rush hour that ultimately resulted in several deaths and more than 150 injuries. That's the human factor, where it grips the entire community, and that was a story that traveled nationally and then also internationally. But here in the Minneapolis community, it was one of those situations where people said, but for the grace of God go I, because you traveled on that bridge on a regular basis. And that's an incident where it's going to grab your entire community, similar to the gas explosion. You can't forget that it's going to impact human lives, and it's going to impact the community. And as a company in that situation, your first order of business is to deal with the human element part of it. And the second is to make sure, as Bob pointed out, you're doing the right thing. And from my perspective, as a lawyer, you always have to put the human element first, and knowing that there's probably going to be legal action that comes out of it. That said, telling the media no comment at that time is not a good plan. And Bob, I think you can comment on that.
Yeah, the night of the collapse, I flew over it for dozens and dozens and dozens of hours. We were the first crew on the scene, actually. And the first call I made from a helicopter were to my sources within federal law enforcement. I wanted to know if the bridge had been blown up. And then once I got the answer, no, I really didn't care how it fell down yet. That comes later. Obviously, everybody wants to know how the clock is built, but in that moment that Jocelyn is talking about, you have a community and nation that is stunned. Then you start thinking about the bridges in your own community and all of that, but that comes down the road. And if you start dealing with that too soon, you're going to lose that human element. And that human element is really the foundation for everything you do. Because if you were good to people, you were compassionate, you were empathetic, you were focused on human beings in those core moments when you knew it wasn't terrorism and that it was a contained problem, then you get, okay, these folks are going to do the right thing. You get goodwill within your community. You get patience within the media, and then you move forward. So it was a critically important first step.
Well, great points, and that speaks to the couple of examples we ran through of engineering related crises. The picture that you now see is a satellite image of Hurricane Sandy. Obviously a devastating hurricane for the New York metropolitan area and other parts of the Northeast. Left roughly 1 million people in the greater New York area without power. Again, something, just acts of God, things that happen that can have devastating consequences. Obviously, for a lot of people in the New York area and elsewhere, it did have devastating consequences. But for people in the energy sector, obviously there are transmission lines that need to be reinstalled, transformers that were underwater, a lot of infrastructure. Another example of things that can befall the industry. This is a photograph of a pipeline explosion in Turkey. This was a pipeline majority owned by BP, and this is only the second example of BP. I don't mean to pick on them, but the interesting thing about this explosion is that although this pipeline was supposed to be one of the most secure pipelines in the world, this was the victim of hackers who, through a wireless network, hacked into the system, tampered with the controls, and as you can see here, caused incredible physical damage. There was another incident, and again, this is not in the energy sector per se, but late last year, Germany's security agency released a report in which it talked about an attack that successfully integrated the controls at a large German steel mill. And the hackers obtained access to the steel mill's controls, were able to cause incredible damage by making it impossible for any of the plant operators to shut down a blast furnace. Now again, that's not a power plant, but we're just talking different types of plants. Security experts tell us, and I'm sure they've told many of the people who are on this webinar, that all of our critical infrastructure remains vulnerable to a number of different types of attack. And in this case, although it was a steel mill and not a power plant, the same thing could happen. One of the important points about the German steel mill incident, by the way, is that it was not somebody coming from the outside and going through a lot of routers, et cetera. It was apparently a spear phishing attack in which the perpetrators used some information about one or more employees, were able to get those employees to either download spyware or log on to a site and provide their operating credentials, and then masquerading as that employee, were able to get other employees to release critical information about that infrastructure. Unless we think this is only overseas, we also have incidents in the United States. This is a report from the Department of Homeland Security and its Industrial Control Systems Cyber Emergency Response Team, or ICS CERT, talking about an incident in the U.S. in which a utility was taken down and its control system was penetrated using the fact that the system had an internet face. That is, people through the internet could gain access to the system. It had a fairly simple password mechanism, and the method of authentication meant that it was something that could be hacked fairly easily. This is fairly routine. In fact, the NSA Director, Admiral Michael Rogers, told a House Intelligence Committee last year that multiple foreign governments had hacked into U.S. critical infrastructure, including water and energy distribution systems, and they had every means to believe that they were going to continue to try to do this. You know, and obviously, this is something that isn't just in the energy sector. Anyone who's been following General Motors, and most recently Volkswagen, knows that there are very severe and unfortunate consequences to all kinds of actions. Jocelyn and Bob have already talked a little bit about the 35W bridge collapse, and it isn't hard to imagine a situation in which either hackers or others take a power grid and take it offline and cause huge problems for people, for businesses, et cetera. So let's talk a little bit about the impacts of catastrophic events. And Jocelyn, do you want to start out by talking about some of the economic impacts?
Sure. The economic impacts of a catastrophic event obviously can be very large. If you've got a catastrophic event where you have a loss of life or multiple deaths, you've got the dollars associated with that, as well as the human impact as well. You've got the property loss. If you have a plant that blows up, if you have a bridge, interstate bridges that goes down, that's over $200 million to replace that type of infrastructure, perhaps even more, into the billions potentially. So catastrophic events along the lines of what we're talking about there's lots of zeros behind them, and especially when we start talking about our energy sector.
Right. Before I turn to Bob, of course, it's not only the cost of and putting aside the human element, which we've talked about a little bit and we'll talk about again, but not just how do you rebuild a plant or how do you rebuild the infrastructure, but if you're not producing energy or not distributing it, your profits take a hit, your customers are displeased, and they potentially have claims against you for that. And then there's reputational damage. And Bob, why don't I turn to you first to address that?
Yeah, reputation is it's life after the issue. It's your life before the issue. A crisis or a catastrophic event should not be the moment in time that measures you. It should not be how you're defined. And it will be if you're not prepared to handle it. We talk about building your crisis communications plan before there's a crisis. You don't want to meet your lawyer in jail. You don't want to meet your doctor on the operating table. And you, exactly. I like to know lawyers in advance of things. And you don't want to meet your brain surgeon in the OR. I mean, you want to have relationships. You want to be prepared for things, because when things happen, you can respond in a more organized way. Now, it doesn't mean the catastrophic event is going to be easy or pleasant or fun to manage, but it is manageable. And we're judged not how we fall, but how we get up. And in this case, your reputation is going to be based on how you solve the problem. It's kind of the old, you're not expected to put the world back together or your grid back together overnight. You can't. I mean, and there's some physical limitations to getting back up and running. But walking toward the crisis, starting to communicate, starting to take the steps that you need to take to get the system back up and running will go a long way. You know, we're trying. Words like that, early, pay dividends. We're trying, and that's the first word you ever heard from a utility after your power's been off for 3 days. It's a little too late. Your reputation in a scenario like this is going to be based on how quickly you can start communicating, how quickly you can start talking about the things you're doing to make things right, because you physically can't solve the problem as quickly as people's patience runs out sometime.
All right, and what are, I don't mean to put you on the spot here, but are there examples of companies that have done it wrong and they've taken a hit with their reputation?
Oh, absolutely.
I suppose Volkswagen might be facing that.
They might be. One that comes to mind is Target Corporation. And this is a pure reputation management situation where the event occurred, the breach occurred. It was followed by a breach of Home Depot and all kinds of other organizations. Lots of companies have been breached. The difference was how you communicate. UCLA Medical Center had a breach. That's personal information, it's medical information, it's financial information. It's very emotional to people. The problem is, in the case of Target, one of the key components of criticism was, I got a letter from my bank. Why didn't the company tell me? Why did a blogger expose this? Why did it take so long? And it's been described as akin to your neighbor watching your house get robbed and not saying anything for 3 or 4 days until you get back from your vacation. No, you should call the police. You should call your neighbor. You should let people know what's going on. It's not easy and it's not pleasant, but from a reputation management standpoint, that's a very recent example. And by the way, some of these other data breaches were a lot bigger than Target, and they got covered up. Fortunately, and I don't know if this is a good thing, our sensitiveness, our sensitivity to data breach, the community that we live in now is getting a little numb to it. It doesn't mean we like it, and it's very personal when it's our bank card that was compromised, but as a society, we're now essentially accepting the fact that people are going to get in and hack companies, and it's not as black cloud on the company as it once was. Again, if you handle it well and quickly.
And Jocelyn, on the slide that's on everybody's screen right now, we don't have this as a separate issue, but you mentioned before we started the program today about your experience with the employees and the stakeholders of a company that's affected by a crisis. Could you talk about that a little bit?
Yes. When bad things happen, they happen to your employees. And you have to recognize that if there's a loss of life, if there's significant injuries, your employees are going to feel responsible. Whether they're responsible or not is another matter. They will feel responsible. If you have a situation where there's a major event, there's a loss of life, people are going to start thinking, number one, I'm responsible. Number two, am I going to go to jail? Number three, if they hold certain types of licenses, engineering licenses, am I going to lose my license? That type of thought process is going through your employee chain, and particularly the key employees who were working on or associated with the structure that may have collapsed or exploded, or been the software people or IT team who was responsible or felt that they were responsible for the breach. You need to deal with that aspect of it right away for multiple reasons. Number one, they're your human capital for your company, and your other employees are going to be watching to see how you deal with this subset. Number two, it's obviously the right thing to do. Number three, the community is going to be watching that. The stories will eventually get out in the community as to how these employees were treated. And number four, their depositions will likely be taken at a later date and time. So how you treat them and how you interact with them, and some of them may need counseling right away. I mean, there's been situations, I can think of one in particular, walking in the room and having a grown man just burst out in tears because he felt so responsible for the event. He wasn't responsible, but that type of emotional impact has to be addressed immediately.
I'll just put off that in a couple of different ways. We've had situations where there's been deaths, say, on a job site. In your own personal life, responding to crisis in your own personal life is someone in the family hears the bad news, goes in their room, cries by themselves, and comes out and says, now I got to handle the whole family. Now I'm going to be the engineer that's going to get everybody else through this, and we're going to talk about it, we're going to cry through it, and we're going to get through it, and now we're going to go to work, and we're going to take care of this problem. If you stop and think about catastrophic events, crisis, as something that you actually deal with far more often than you think you do. I usually ask people when I'm doing crisis preparedness training to raise their hand if they're perfect. And I usually get 10 or 12 people a year, after which I usually ask to call their spouse just to verify.
They're all those lawyers?
No. They would put it in writing, of course, right? But the idea is the human side, let them have it out. Let them feel, and because you're going to be stunned. And I talk to people in manufacturing sites, for example, and they say, well, okay, we've got our plan, and we can handle it. I said, great, when's the last time you saw someone walk out here with no arm or literally on fire? That's the kind of emotion, that's the kind of thing that happens all too frequently. And you have to accept it and take that deep breath and move on from a human side. Now, from my old days in the media, I didn't have to look for quote-unquote dirt when a situation happened in a company that was not doing the right thing. The employees would call me. They would send me video. In this day and age of smartphones, if something blows up, I've got video of it pretty quick because the employees are unhappy with the way they've been communicated with. Oh, all they talk about is getting the plant back online. All they talk about is getting back to business. All they talk about, they don't care about us. And when people don't feel as if they're being taken care of as human beings first, then they tend to leak. The number one source of leaked stories to the media is from the inside.
Well, there's another point to that too, and we'll talk in a little more detail about it later, but Jocelyn, you and I have both had experiences in which employees feeling that they had not been treated fairly or that they were the voice of reason in a company, or maybe if it wasn't the employees, at least the plaintiff's bar uses they didn't think about the people first. Maybe you could talk about that a little.
Sure. The plaintiff's bar will definitely pick up on any story where you haven't looked after the people. And they're also going to pick up on any story where, today we're talking about what is your plan? You have to have a plan in place. And, reputational impacts obviously are going to involve a PR strategy. The plaintiff's bar will pick up on that, and they'll try to use that in any subsequent litigation, follow-on litigation. As a company, and from my perspective, the lawyers, experienced lawyers on your defense team know that's coming. They know it's coming. So you have to say, as a company, we're not going to let that get in the way of having a plan. We're not going to let that threat get in the way of the company doing the right thing, and understanding that there's ways to address that. And again, from the legal standpoint, the lawyers will address it in terms of the argument that's made during an opening at trial, in terms of, and they had Bob on scene immediately. They were more interested in getting their PR and their legal ducks in a row than they were in addressing the people. And if you're addressing the people at the same time that you're starting to protect the legal side of it, a jury pool is going to recognize that, and they're going to say, you know what, they are a business, but as long as we hear that they were talking to their people, and they were working together, and they were addressing the community's issues, it's not going to come back to, nip you in the rear end.
Great. Well, I know that our participants, I don't know, if you call someone on a webinar, are they viewers, are they listeners, or webinarians, whatever they are. But I'm sure that people want to get some prescriptions for how to deal with some of these issues. So we'll go a little more quickly through some of these impacts. Regulatory impacts, obviously it depends upon the industry, but for those in the energy industry, depending upon the type of crisis, obviously it is going to affect relations with perhaps the Environmental Protection Agency, maybe the State Public Utilities Commission, could be the Department of Homeland Security. As I mentioned earlier, I'm from Washington, D.C. Just recently, our local utility, Pepco, agreed to be acquired, and at first, our local Public Utilities Commission held up the deal, and was the only jurisdiction to do so. And part of that, I think, was the lack of equity that Pepco had in the community. They were much pilloried for their slow response to weather events and outages. So in addition to speaking to regulators in the aftermath of a crisis, the nature of the response can make your life easy or difficult going forward.
One of the areas that we should probably wrap our arms around throughout this webinar is the fact that the communications team and the lawyers teams are working together. It's not the communication strategy, the legal strategy, it is the combined strategy for the well-being of the client, the customer, the organization. And clearly, one of the first things we do from a communication side is identify what that legal strategy is going to be. Now, you get into the weeds a little bit in the regulatory environment, whether it's the utilities or it's the financials or healthcare, food, horrifically regulated in some ways. If you had a product recall, for example, you're dealing with a lot of people. You're trying to get the word out. You're dealing with, in the case of food, for example, the CDC, when people are getting sick and dying. There are a lot of people involved. If you can work with your regulators to the extent that you can, and with your lawyers, and writing things and communicating to the important audiences externally, frankly, that makes the regulator's job easier in the sense that you're doing the work of communicating public health or public information about a utility. You're helping them get the word out, and that helps them. And when you help them, that's good for you.
Absolutely, and much of my work with the regulators does not directly involve utilities, but for instance, we have a number of clients who produce consumer products, and working with the Consumer Product Safety Commission. Mm-hmm. If you develop, or your clients develop, a reputation as being forthright, responsive, and willing to reveal information even before all the facts are known, the regulators are going to cut you some slack at other points. If, on the other hand, you're digging in your heels all the time, the regulators hear from other nations' regulators or other, the police department or something else, they don't hear from you, you're going to have a rougher road. Jocelyn?
That flow of information can go two ways. And so the regulators, let's use the NTSB for an example, they have the ability, obviously, as do all of our regulatory bodies, to issue subpoena after subpoena and ask for more information in terms of documents and data, access to your people. But if you work with the regulators, my experience has been that when you need information as a company, when you would like to have some insight as to what the regulatory body is starting to think, that information is shared with you. And sometimes it won't be on the record, but that's helpful to you as a company. It's helpful to your team in understanding where the regulatory body is coming from. And the other part of that too is the regulatory body, can come in and deny you access to the site, whether you own it or not. They can deny you access to the site in that situation. And so the more that you set up a spirit of cooperation, the better off you're going to be. And that doesn't mean just caving and saying, okay,
sure,
we're just going to let them develop any type of theory against us, and it is what it is. It's making sure that you're being smart about it, but you're being prudent and you're being cooperative.
To play off of that, there's a situation we've been dealing with, and it started out as a civil matter, and you hope it stays there. But it was, after much communication on a recall situation, I was sitting in an audience, and a federal regulator was speaking on as a case study, and made the comment that no one could have seen this coming. This was unforeseeable. That's gold to attorneys. The first, from a communication standpoint, I'm taking great notes and sending it right to the legal team so that they have it, you have it in your box that you can pull out later. And regulators that feel like the company that has dealt with them, to Jocelyn's point, well, are going to start sharing they really did all they could. And this is what they did. And that's quotable. And that's important as you get down to the point from the initial impact of the situation to the response to the situation to where you guys live, and that's the litigation down the road.
Right. This isn't strictly regulatory. This is the halls of Congress. It could just as well be a state legislative committee. Probably most people recognize this figure. This is Tony Hayward, the former chairman of BP, who was asked by some folks in Washington to spend a little bit of time at the Capitol answering some questions. This doesn't quite capture the full angst that he expressed about the experience, but I think just looking in his eyes, you get the impression that he was not having his best day ever. And that is one of the effects. When something unfortunate happens, there is not only a quest for truth, but there's also the quest for political grandstanding. I don't know if I'm putting that too mildly or too strongly.
Well, absolutely. It's there. It's a circus. I mean, it. And when, unfortunately, there are opportunities for people in Washington to push agendas and make hay based on an event, whether it's, after a tragic shooting at a college, then the gun lobby, there's the gun discussion. Or if, whatever the issue is, if it's a food safety, how come we didn't know? If it's an automotive, we didn't talk about it. Why are you, keeping information from the consumers in the United States? So there's clearly the arena of the spectacle of federal hearings. And one of the problems with that is, and I know you guys have both experienced this, is often in these hearings, the people asking the questions are not armed with the most up-to-date information. And the questions are more based on bias and agenda for a surrounding issue sometimes. So So this is where you have to be, or a speech with a question mark. So this points out, and Tony Hayward obviously probably played this about as poorly as you could in terms of his reaction to it with the "I want my life back" comment. But it speaks again to this preparation thing. If you're a large company and you're doing big things and you don't have key people media trained, but equally as important, ready to go down to your state capital or the United States Capitol and be able to present your position, look at the airline industry. The airline industry was called on the carpet over and over and over and over again when fares were high, or post 9/11 in security, and you get 5 or 6 CEOs lined up at a table. Those organizations know it's coming. It's part of their standard response.
Mary Barra, after the ignition switch.
Yeah.
The other thing to keep in mind here is when you involve the political aspect of it is you will not be able to have a whole lot of control. So the one thing that you can control is your response. And I've been in hearings and closed door meetings where we've been trying to resolve an issue, and all of a sudden, you're told, we're calling a press conference tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock and we're going to release our preliminary engineering report to the public. And you step back and go, time out here. Why? Why are you doing this? We're here to try to work with you to solve this problem. What is that going to accomplish other than inflaming emotions? And the response that you're going to get back if you've got somebody who wants to pursue a political agenda isn't going to be something that you're going to be able to control their actions, but you can control your response to it. And I think that's the hardest part for key executives, who are used to being able to control the outcome of an event. When you're in this type of situation, you're not going to be able to control the outcome of the event, but you are going to be able to control your response.
That's a great point, Jocelyn. We're going to move quickly through some of the other impacts because I know folks who are following us here are anxious to hear, okay, I understand that you can get yourself in deep trouble. What do I do about it? So I promise everybody we're going to turn to that in just a second. But, apart from finding yourself testifying before some of your elected representatives, there certainly are other impacts, and this is pretty well known, so we don't have to spend a great deal of time. But, you have problems with customer suits. Oops, excuse me. Jumped ahead a little bit. If you're providing power or fuel to someone and they don't have what they need to operate, I'm sure you're going to hear from their lawyers. Shareholder suits, governmental civil suits, and the potential for criminal liability or investigations either on the federal or state level. And although this is not energy,
now to an unprecedented punishment for a corporate executive. Former peanut company chief Stuart Parnell sentenced to 28 years in prison for knowingly selling tainted peanut butter, blamed for 9 deaths. He could spend the rest of his life in prison. ABC's Steve Osensami is in Atlanta with the story. Good morning, Steve.
Good morning to you, George. This former CEO is already 61 years old, so they're calling this a virtual life sentence. This morning, a first-of-its-kind decision and a loud and clear message about safety to America's food industry.
The food safety lost out to greed.
Former peanut company CEO Stuart Parnell is in an Albany, Georgia jail cell right now. A federal judge sentenced him to 28 years Monday after one of his roasting plants was blamed for a deadly salmonella outbreak in 2008. 9 people died. 714 got sick across 46 states. At trial, prosecutors shared emails where they say Parnell pushed employees to sell tainted food, saying, just ship it. I cannot afford to lose another customer. Gabrielle Mounier was one of those customers. Her son Christopher was 7 years old when he got sick. She spoke at Parnell's sentencing.
I have to tell you, when I first spotted him, I wanted to cry. I feel badly that this should have never happened. It should have never happened to begin with.
Courts are now holding food company executives and even farmers responsible for dangerous outbreaks. In April, 2 egg company executives got 3-month sentences after a 2010 salmonella outbreak. Last year, 2 cantaloupe farmers were sentenced to 5 years probation and 6 months home detention for a listeria outbreak in 2011. But Parnell's nearly 3-decade prison sentence is now the stiffest punishment the industry has ever seen.
My mother Shirley beat cancer and died from eating peanut butter. Today was a victory. It was justice for her and other families who needlessly suffered and ate food that they believed to be properly processed.
Parnell isn't the only executive at his company facing real time. His brother was sentenced to 20 years. Another executive at the company was sentenced to 5. Robin?
All right, see those comments from the victim's family.
All right, so, you know, it might appear, well, that's a little different. This is somebody selling tainted peanut butter, and it couldn't happen in any other industry. You know, maybe not. If you're, you know, if you defer maintenance on something or ignore a warning about a cyber threat and people's home medical equipment doesn't work, or the nursing home is without power for a prolonged period of time, or what have you, you know, you might find yourself in the crosshairs. What do you think, Bob and Jocelyn?
I think you're absolutely right. I mean, one of the things that you have to understand is there's always going to be the human element of the story, and Bob can address it from the media standpoint in terms of the PR. I'll address it from the plaintiff's bar. The plaintiff's bar, we have some very, very smart, talented people who are plaintiff's lawyers. They're very good at what they do, and they're great at telling a story. And when you give them ammunition to tell a really, really good story that's going to pull at the heartstrings of a jury, or, you know, if you're looking at what is the settlement value of it, and you do model mock jury programs, you'll see this, you know, firsthand in terms of how the plaintiff's bar can craft a story. And they're going to be better storytellers than you'll ever be able to tell, because you're on the defensive side and they're telling a story about a catastrophic event where, in many cases, when we're talking about loss of life or personal injuries, those victims didn't do anything wrong. They didn't do anything wrong other than use your product, whether it's energy or some other product, and as a result, they sustained injury. There's no comparable, you know, liability going back in terms of, well, you're 50% at fault because, you know, you didn't follow the directions. In the cases that we're talking about, your victims are frequently zero liability on their side.
You know, the beauty is that the plaintiff's lawyer doesn't even have to write the script because you wrote it for him. In this case, it was emails. And in a lot of cases, it's emails. Or it's, to your point, Chip, maintenance not being kept up, maintenance records being falsified after the fact. These things happen on a regular basis. If you're a hotel and you own a swimming pool and people get sick, or a fountain, and people get Legionnaire's disease, and then all of a sudden you go back and you realize that all those logs that were supposed to be filled out weren't filled out, and then now the handwriting is all the same, and the pen is exactly the same color, and the numbers don't make sense. All of these moments of crisis, it's to the point where we go over the hump, where most of the time people don't want anything bad to happen, the vast majority of the time. But in a scenario like this, and I believe really what they got Parnell on was the documentation. It was you know, basically fraud more than killing someone. He's not convicted of murder. He created an environment where he basically, if you believe the conviction, which people do, he cheated. He didn't tell the truth. He went around. He skirted the safety protocols of an industry. And he documented it, or it was documented. And that's a really dangerous hurdle to try to overcome.
Bob, you raise a great point. But, you know, when we talk about the documents, the story will come from the documents. It almost always comes from the documents. And when you're a company facing a catastrophic event, incident, you will have bad documents. They're there. And we live in an electronic age today where you just cannot control totally the flow of information. And through electronic discovery, the other side's going to get access to your information, and they're going to find the bad documents. And there may only be a couple of them. They may be taken out of context.
It only takes one.
Right. They may be taken out of context. But for example, if it's a project that goes poorly, and there's an email that says, you know, we're over budget, we're going to stop billing time, or we're going to cut back on the engineers assigned to this project. We don't have time to do a QA/QC analysis. Those are bad emails, and they're going to come back to haunt you, and your very talented plaintiff's bar is going to be all over those emails.
Jocelyn, that's a great segue to our next segment on what it's like to operate in the midst of a crisis. I know that all three of us here have had experiences with this. Who wants to take the first shot at what's going on? Give us a sense of what it's like. We can lay it all out here. Sounds very plausible. You know, think of the individuals, have a clear message, you know, don't say anything ridiculous, express empathy, get to the root of the problem, et cetera, et cetera. Does it really play out always quite that sensibly?
If it doesn't, you're going to have a disaster. It's sort of, in aviation, it's aviate, navigate, communicate in that issue. When you have a problem with your airplane as a pilot, you do those basic things. It's a time of high tension. One of the things, unfortunately, you see in a crisis situation, especially with a team of executives, is they don't all agree. Who's going to be right? Who's going to be blamed? Everybody wants credit for the success, but no one wants to take ownership of the problem. So making sure your team is in place beforehand is a big deal. And what we see is when you have teams, executive teams, crisis communications folks that come in, whether it's your IT people, with your lawyers, with your HR people, with your senior leadership, when that team is bonded before you go into a situation, you tend to come out of it kind of game tested and things go well for you. The biggest problem that you see is fear, lack of trust, and essentially too much focus on the crisis. So let me play off of that for a minute. If I'm worried about the living room set, oh, it's my grandmother's living room set, the chairs, the table, I got to get that out, and the house is on fire, and you save the living room furniture, the rest of the house is burned down. And there are times when organizations get so focused on protecting what they did wrong that they forget about everything else in their company. They forget about their reputation. They forget about their customers. They forget about all of the things except for the one legal issue, the tort. Okay, what happened? Now you got to resolve it, but you can't take your eye off the business. And one of the biggest things we see is that outcomes that come out poorly is due to slow response, fear of being honest with the lawyers, with the communications team, with yourself. If you can't sit in a room and say, darn it, we screwed up. If you can't have that private moment, you're going to be in a rough spot. And you need to be able to have that team in place. You need to be able to trust each other because it is not a time where you need to learn how everybody functions. You have to trust.
That's a great point, Bob, about you need to be able to trust each other. That said, human nature tends to cause people to respond differently and not in a uniform manner. And in one case that I still shake my head at today, the senior executives were more concerned with protecting themselves, so that when we had the initial meeting and we talked about what is the approach here, what's the right approach, before I could leave the building that evening, several of them cornered me separately and said, I'm going to hire my own individual lawyer, which puts you in a difficult spot because you represent the corporation, not the senior leadership team as individuals. I understand the fear that they feel, but somebody needs to lead, and it isn't always about you. It's a line that I use with my kids all the time. It isn't always about you. my teenage son always says, but it's always about you, Mom. But in any event, your senior leadership team needs to be tested, as Bob said, and understand that in that situation, it isn't about protecting them as individuals. It's about the best interest of the organization, which in turn should go hand in glove with the best interest of the people piece of it as well.
And you see it with organizations. Sometimes, Chip, it's a hard conversation, but sometimes we've had to say to people, why are you here? Why are you the chief administrator of a hospital? What gets you out of bed in the morning? Is it your profit sharing, or because you're a doctor and you care about saving lives? And you got to go at them sometimes. You really have to get into that core human side, because it does come out. They're in it for themselves. They're frightened. They're terrified. If you can get them to back up. We see it, you know where we see it most often? Is when a board member does something wrong. We see it far too frequently. A great organization, and they have great board members, and one person does something horrible. There was an example recently where a physician on a board of an organization we work with was arrested for child pornography at his office on a Friday night. And so Saturday morning we're on the phone talking about it. And there's a lot of, whoa, let's slow down. Because boards protect one another quite often. And you have to say to yourself, well, why do you sit on this board? If that person who is in the wrong cared so much about this organization, they would step down. And so between now and noon, we're going to give them the opportunity to step down, or we're just going to take care of it for them. This is not really a time for anything less than tough love.
All right, and then I want to pose another situation. As we see on the slide here, you're operating under the crucible of time. You want answers, the media want answers, the public wants answers, the regulators everybody wants an answer. You don't want, as you've alluded to earlier, for the story to play itself out before you've had a chance to weigh in and have something to say about it. How do you balance that with the need to really, unless you just go and, if it's pretty obvious, you look out the window and you see what the problem is, that's fine. But a lot of these situations, it takes a while to get to the heart of the issue. How do you deal with that?
Well, you start with, wow, it's been a really rough day. Gunman comes into your office, starts shooting up the place, and you have dead employees, and you're in front of the media. And whether you should be or shouldn't be, that's for some other time to discuss. You're not there to solve the problem. It's the bridge collapse. Again, you have to express a willingness to communicate. There's a phrase that I like to use, and that is the lack of communication creates distance, and distance creates distrust. The longer it takes you to communicate, the more distrust there is. People are going to go around the edges to try to find information. When a plane crashes, when a plane is missing in the ocean, we don't know what happened, we don't know where it is, we don't know what happened to the people, but you can be the CEO of an airline, which we've seen in Asia, and they come out and they sit at a table in chaos and say, we're not going to make any assumptions. Our first priority is to deal with the investigators to try to find out what happened to this aircraft. We're not going to make assumptions. We are working with their families. We're communicating with all the passengers' families. We've set up call centers. We've set up this, and this. You don't know anything. It doesn't mean you can't do something, and it doesn't mean you can't communicate. Get out there and tell the world, we're sorry, we care, we're working on it, we're right there with you. We don't know either, because, frankly, those organizations want to know just as quickly and badly as the public. So take baby steps. Communicate what you do know. And what you know is that a terrible thing has happened, and you didn't want it to happen. And you're going to try like crazy to make sure it doesn't happen again with the help of the people that can solve what happened.
In these types of catastrophic incidents, we live in the information age. So if the company's not out there, providing information is going to be put forward. Whether it's good information or bad information, it's coming out there. So if you're not there and your comment is no comment, or talk to the hand, the information's coming from somewhere else, and it's not going to be good for your company.
Yeah, just real quick, on that point, it's the idea that nothing circles the globe faster than a lie. And if you're not the first voice in the world's ear, your competitors will be, or the plaintiff's attorneys. Someone's going to get in there, and it's really hard to pull the lie out of the world's ear and insert the truth. You have to be the first voice in, and even if that's just acknowledging that you're working on it.
That's a terrific point. I want to see if I could get your comments on a video that we're going to play here.
Look, guys, it has been an extremely long...
Stop right here, and Bob, maybe you could remind us all who Gary Southern is and why he's talking in this video.
This is a situation in West Virginia where the company had an environmental spill and polluted essentially the drinking water for 300,000 to 400,000 people. And what you're going to watch is a news conference that was, well, as you will see, is probably was not the best use of his time in front of the media, and more importantly, again, you go through the media to get to your community. So
why don't we play this?
This is a good one. Yeah.
So what you're saying is think water as you watch.
Think water, yes.
I'm having a hard trouble talking at the moment. I would appreciate it if we could wrap this thing up. I will...
we actually have a lot of questions, and it's been a long day for a lot of people who don't have water. So can you give us an exact timeline as to how this all happened? The DEP was saying earlier today, as early as 8:15 yesterday morning, they were getting reports, and that you all did not call it in until 12 noon. The DEP was already here at 11:15. So what's the timeline on all this?
We were aware of the leaking storage tank around 10:30. We load tank trucks of this material on a regular basis, and occasionally we've had reports of an odor previously. So we were first aware of any material being spilled at 10:30 yesterday. Could it have been earlier than yesterday? Because we've also received reports into our newsroom that it was as early as Wednesday, possibly Tuesday. People were starting to smell this in the area. We have no information on that. Are there no systems in place to alert you of a leak at your facility other than a smell? At this moment in time, I think that's all we have time for. So thanks for coming. Thanks for your time. We have more questions. Hey. No, we're not done. You're not done. We're not done. No. Anyone else have any other questions?
Ouch.
A refreshing multiple drinks of water when nobody else has water.
Look, guys, it has been an extremely long
there.
day. I'm having
It took him all of 2 seconds to screw it up. It really did. It's been a long day. You know what? I'm sorry it's been a long day. This is not about you. This is not about the company. This is about the fact that we have harmed our community. So the very first words you hear in 2 to 3 seconds is all about me, and it can't be all about you.
All right.
Trouble talking at the moment.
Sorry you have a sore throat.
I would appreciate it if we could wrap this thing up. I will...
10 seconds. I'm going to be transparent, but I got to go. It's been a long day. Well, you didn't tell me anything.
We actually have a lot of questions, and it's been a long day.
The reporter is now taking control. The reporters are now driving your messages. Now he's in defensive mode. They've just intercepted the pass.
For a lot of people who don't have water. So can you give us an exact timeline as to how this...
When you pollute the drinking water of 400,000 people, please don't drink water on camera.
Happened. The DEP was saying earlier today, as early as 8:15 yesterday morning, they were getting reports, and that you all did not call it in until 12 noon. The DEP was already here at 11:15. So what's the timeline on all this?
We were aware of the leaking storage tank around 10:30.
Stop right there. Why are you answering questions about the specificity of the crisis? You're not really in a good position. You don't know what happened yet, and he says that. You know what? I appreciate the question. It's something that we want to know. We want to know exactly what took place, and that's why we're working with state regulators to determine exactly what the cause was.
Load tank trucks of this material on a regular basis, and occasionally we've had reports of
reports previously of things. Okay, so now I put my old investigative reporter hat on. The first thing I'm going to do is go through state records to see how many spills that they've had. You just opened up the door for a bigger issue.
Previously, so we were first aware of any material being spilled at 10:30 yesterday.
Could it have been earlier than yesterday? Because we've also received reports into our newsroom that it was as early as Wednesday, possibly Tuesday. People were starting to smell this in the area.
We have no information on that.
Are there no systems?
All right, so now the reporter, I have no information on that. That's actually not a bad answer. You know, I really appreciate that. We'd love to talk to the people if they can, you know, contact us off in a minute. We'd love to talk to them to gather more information. Why? So that we can make sure we understand what happened here, and more importantly, make sure that it never happens again versus being defensive.
You know,
in place that it's
your point about staying away from specificity, from a legal standpoint, he's now said 10:30 twice.
Mm-hmm.
It's an admission against interest at this point, and he's going to have a hard time if that answer is actually wrong of ever straying away from it, because he's on tape twice saying 10:30, and it's almost a contemporaneous communication, and so he's boxed himself and the company in at this point.
And this is a great example where the communication objective and the legal objective come together. And all the more reason I'm
to alert you of a leak at your facility other than a smell?
At this moment in time, I think that's all we have time for. So thanks for coming. Thanks for your time.
We have more questions. Hey. No, we're not done.
You're not done.
We're not done. No.
It's really even hard to when you leave a microphone, don't ever come back. don't for any reason come back unless you want to correct something that's positive. This is just a classic example of an executive going in front of cameras, not speaking to the community, making it about themselves, creating potential problems from a litigation standpoint, a legal standpoint. He is clearly not media trained to handle this because of the stammering. He didn't know how to answer questions well. He was too quick to answer questions.
But he does have the water bottle.
But he does have the water. We encourage people to have water when they're speaking publicly in any other situation. But this really
Anyone else have any other questions?
What happens when you open your mouth in such a way that it's not on message? You know, these are communication opportunities. They're not just open-ended dialogues.
One other brief point here. On your screen now is the first page of a class action complaint that was filed against Volkswagen Group of America, I think 3 days after the story broke about the defeat device in the diesel cars. There, of course, have been cases filed all over the country since then. Jocelyn, perhaps you could comment just briefly. When you're dealing with a crisis, you're trying to deal with the media, you're trying to get at you're dealing with the employees, you're trying to get the facts in order, you're trying to make sure that you've protected vital documents. What does it mean to have plaintiff's attorneys also on your case, to have government investigators asking questions? Tell us what that's like.
It's not a fun time, and you need a point person within the organization. Sometimes it's in the Office of General Counsel, and frequently it could be somebody on the business side. But you need that point person, and that point person has to be working with the legal team. That point person has to be working with the PR team. That person should be assigned full time to the matter, because somebody's got to lead here, and somebody's got to look at it big picture. But that person also has to keep in mind they may not always have the right answer. They may not know which way to go, and it should be a collaborative process. But ultimately, that person needs to be able to make the decision and work with the executive leadership team. So as part of your planning process, make sure that you identify that person, make sure that you've given considerable thought to who that person is, and make sure that that person is very self-aware in terms of the corporation, self-aware in terms of public perception, is able to work with a large group of very strong-minded, intelligent people who believe they know best, and they probably do for their segment of it, but looking at the big picture in terms of how to proceed.
Let's tell our viewers and listeners about how they can prepare for a crisis and deal with it. And we've got the well-known Confucius quote about the importance of preparation and the two kind of overarching themes of preparation. I mean, the first thing is if you look for potential problems and you identify them in advance, you can prevent a catastrophic event in the first place. And then the second thing is if you've identified those problems and thought them through, and of course you can't anticipate everything, but if you can identify some of them, it helps with both a response that's both prompt and accurate. The first point is conducting what we've termed an audit of your company's operations, processes, and records. That means starting out with something equivalent to what those of you with engineering backgrounds are familiar with as a failure modes effects analysis, in which a group of people really thinks through what are all of the possible impacts that could befall a company, what would the causes of those be, what would be the impacts, and what can be done about it. Do you have all of your aspects of your engineering, are they up to snuff? Are there vulnerabilities? Can you address those or at least be prepared for them? Even if everything is new and works great, what are the possible things that could go wrong, and what are you going to do about it? Third-party vulnerability audits. Although several of us here, I guess all three of us, have worked with incidents involving the cyber realm, I, for one, would not hold myself out as being particularly expert in how to close back doors or look and avoid cyber vulnerabilities. Nor would I presume to tell somebody how they could improve the engineering of their plants or their various functions. Having third-party experts take a look at that can be important. Records. Anyone on the phone who has a legal background, and even those who don't, know how critical records are to have in a crisis. And it's not just, well, we've got the stuff somewhere. If something breaks, and I can't tell you how many times this has happened with my clients, we need to get an answer quickly. We've got a regulator that wants an answer. We've got a public that wants answers. And we say, well, we're going to get to it. And, well, where are those records? Well, they're with our supplier. Where's the supplier? Well, the supplier is overseas. Well, let's get a hold of them. We can't. It's a holiday over there. How long does the holiday last? It's a month-long holiday or a week-long holiday. Or we've got those records are in deep storage. Or who would have them? Well, Phil has it. Where's he? He's on vacation. The point is, you really need to figure out all of the documents and records, both electronic and hard copy, that are potentially going to be important to identifying how things are done, how a process works, et cetera, and have them handy. And I would go further and say it's better to have those in a couple of different ways. If it's solely electronic, you have a problem if your electronic systems go down for one reason or another. If it's in paper, make sure it's someplace where it's secure and accessible. I grew up in a small city in which someone thought the great place to have the emergency preparedness agency's offices were in the basement of the city hall, which is located in the center of a river. And let's just say it didn't work out too well and they had to respond to a flood since they were 30 feet beneath the surface. Make sure you can get to this stuff. Identify all the people who need to be involved in responding to a problem. And obviously this is going to vary by problem, but you need your engineering staff, the people who know how a plant runs, the people who know how to pull up critical records, the people involved in making business decisions. You need to know who to get a hold of, and you have to know how to get a hold of them. And then as you're going through this audit, identify ways of either avoiding a problem or if a problem should occur, how to deal with it and minimize the effects. Insurance coverage. This seems like an obvious point, but all too often people wait until they have a problem to figure out what the extent of their coverage is. And, there are things that are beyond strict regular insurance coverage. There often is recovery expertise that insurance companies provide, assistance in reaching out to customers, et cetera, or third parties who are not insurers that can help recover critical assets. And finally, reviewing document retention practices to make sure both that documents that are going to be important in answering a question about crises are not lost or destroyed. And that means that there are certain records you've got to really think through, are they going to be destroyed in your regular document destruction cycle, or are there certain categories of documents you need to preserve longer, and do you have the ability to place a litigation hold in place right away? Jocelyn and Bob, do you want to talk a little bit about developing a crisis response team?
Certainly. What I want to do, though, is I'm going to take this out of order because it ties to a comment that you just made on the insurance piece of it. When we're looking at a catastrophic incident, we're talking about big dollars, which means you're probably going to go up the tower in terms of your insurance coverage. You need to, as part of putting your crisis plan together, you need to know who's going to be notifying the insurer, and you need to know what the requirements are for notice for each insurance policy. An example that I'll give you is you can't assume that they're all the same, because some companies, and these are more on the in the world of engineering policies, E&O policies, they may have a provision in that policy that requires you to notify a specific person, a specific lawyer, and you have to provide that person notice. So be aware of what your policy says in terms of notice. Make sure you're giving the proper notice, and make sure that you understand that in a catastrophic incident, the insurance companies will be hiring their own lawyers. We call them monitoring counsel. They're not usually our best friends in terms of lead counsel, but they are part of the team, and they're going to let you know every chance they get they are part of the team, so don't exclude them.
Because I know we want to get into the nuts and bolts of actually responding and putting together the crisis plan, but again, we've listed some of the folks that need to be considered to be included in a crisis response team. And very briefly, Bob, I know we're getting short on time, but what is the importance of having a crisis response team put together in advance? You want to have your team in place, whether it's 4 people, 8 people. It's the team. It keeps too many chefs out of the kitchen. You know each other, you trust each other. It's that bond that you have. Everybody knows what their role is. They have a backup if they're not available, and they know what their teams are responsible for. All right.
Chip, can I just touch on something on the slide here? Outside experts. And in preparing a catastrophic event plan, you've got to be prepared to identify your outside experts in terms of a litigation strategy immediately after the catastrophic event. Because if you have a situation where there are multiple parties who could be at fault, everybody's on the hunt for the best experts in the country and in the world. And those experts get gobbled up quickly. So you don't want to be the person who makes the call or have your legal team make the call and you find out that you were too late and now the other side's got the better expert. So that does have to be part of the strategy as well in terms of the legal aspect, is making sure that you retain the best experts as quickly as possible.
Right, and here when we're talking about preparation, obviously you can't anticipate everything, but in certain key areas, having experts lined up in advance who know the operation, who know the plants, so they can hit the ground running, and so that you have them engaged in advance, is something we're thinking about. And the last point I'll make here is, it's an unfortunate title, but to call it victim services, and that is, the point both of you made earlier, you need to have an apparatus ready and somebody in charge of reaching out, making sure that people are taken care of, making sure that they have a place to stay, making sure that they're looked after. Now move to a crisis plan. And Bob, you want to start talking about this a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. The crisis plan is your playbook. We've had organizations come to us with 400 and 500 and 600-page crisis plans. It's totally useless. I'll just repeat that. Totally useless. You can't do anything with it. A good crisis plan right now is about 30 to 40 pages maximum. It involves naming your crisis communications team, your team in the room, all of their contact stuff, the experts that you just talked about. What are the roles for each part of your organization? What is the escalation tree, if you will? If this happens, then we need to meet this quickly. If this happens, we need to meet this quickly. It's that playbook. So what we're trying to do, again, I go back to airline pilots. They fly the plane, but they follow the manual. Brief, concise, and easy to use, because you may have to drop other people in. And if you're trying to think or interpret your plan during a crisis, you're really out of luck. There's a friend of mine who's a college football coach, briefly, and I said, your defense must be very complicated. And he says, no, it's the opposite. Clear minds make quick feet. My athletes get to be athletes when they're not thinking about a complicated defensive playbook. It's the same thing in communication. Clear minds make clear messages.
All right, and we mentioned here delineating clear lines of responsibility. Jocelyn, why is that important?
Well, it's important because you're in a crisis situation. Some people respond better to stress than others. Some people you will see them at their brightest and best, and others who normally are among the best may fall down in this situation. Knowing what roles that you play and understanding that that is your role, and you will not try to do something beyond that. And so that's important, because everybody's got a role here. You've got the corporate side of it, you've got the person who should be leading, you've got the legal piece of it, you've got the PR piece of it, you've got the insurance piece of it, you just can keep going down the line. You need leadership. And the legal team and the PR team need to be working hand in glove. And we'll touch on some of the privilege issues very shortly coming up, but they need to be working hand in glove, because you're crafting your strategy at that point. And there's no reason for the legal team's ego or the PR team's ego to get in the way, and that's quite frankly not something that the leadership person needs to be dealing with. It's, let's talk about this, let's make sure everybody understands what their role is, let's make sure that there's a go-to person, a point person, and let's make sure we don't have a maverick. The last thing you need at that point in time is a maverick.
Very briefly, familiarizing the organization with crisis responsibilities. Is it only the folks in the inner sanctum who need to know what to do, at least in general terms, about who gets to talk and who takes the lead?
Yeah, I think in general terms it is. It's important that the people on the team, the people involved in the team, know it and drill it and talk about it on a regular basis. But it's also important to spread the message throughout your organization in smaller groups, one-on-ones, small, whatever the industry is, crew meetings, whatever it is, that you have a plan in place. So if your whole organization knows that there's a plan in place in case something goes wrong, then the outcome can be better, but then it doesn't become some happy accident. Things went the right way because you had a plan in place. And that's something for your employees to know. It's important for them to know. It's a security measure for them.
And we also have update 3 times in all caps. Is that because the keyboard was stuck? Or?
Yeah, absolutely not. The idea that a crisis plan is a living, changing document. It's just like your crisis. You have to be flexible, and your plan has to be flexible and adaptable. People go on maternity leave, people go on vacation, people retire, phone numbers change, office responsibilities change, your business models change. You're constantly changing and evolving, and your plan has to as well. Where do you keep your plan? You touched on it before. Well, we put it out in the guard shack. Well, okay, the gunman's in the guard shack. Where is it now? Well, it's out in the parking lot. I know, but your parking lot's under construction. Where are you going to put your people? It's a constant revision, and if you do it quarterly, you tend to have a fresher plan.
Right, and we touched on it a little bit in this slide and the previous slide, but to elaborate just briefly, in a time of crisis, you need to know how to reach people. And that goes with the people on the crisis team. It needs to be, depending upon what the problem is, you need to reach the engineers or the plant managers or the people that can help you figure out what exactly is going on and how you're going to solve it. And people's numbers do change. And so the fact that you put all this together in 1975 may not work so well for you today.
Going back to your point, Chip, about the broader communication and who should know, one of the problems we see with organizations sometimes is they have great plans in place and they're ready to go, but they don't get the information from the field fast enough. People out there don't know who to contact to tell them there's a problem. An employee just died. There was an environmental spill. They want to handle it in their own site, and they forget that there's a plan in place.
Well, that happened with General Motors, as a matter of fact. The report on their ignition defect, they had all kinds of different engineering organizations. It was like the story of people touching the elephant. They all knew a little bit about it, but no one was passing it up. They were fearful of passing it up to senior management, and nobody really got the big picture. So let's talk a little bit, and we've already done this, so we can move right ahead. Responding to the catastrophic event. All right, so the event takes place. The plant's been hacked and has you can't turn it off, and the boiler is burning the place down, or all the switches have been flipped, so you can't send out the electricity, or all your pipes are rupturing. What do you do?
Well, you turn your plant. And I keep repeating that, but that's the one thing that's calm and steady in a crisis situation, in a difficult situation. You enact all the things you know you're supposed to do. That's what it is. You take the information in, you listen, you gather information, you figure it out, and you act accordingly. It sounds very simple, and it's the idea that gathering information quickly, processing information quickly, and communicating to the people on your team, the outside counsel, letting everybody know, okay, what is going on? Here's what we know right now. Here's what we know 15 minutes later. You can't communicate enough in those circumstances. And most importantly, get your people to safety. That's the one thing that I will always say. No matter what this situation is, make sure your people are okay.
We talk a little bit, and Jocelyn, you and I, of course, know this firsthand, and getting the documents together, locking down the site, if there's physical evidence, making sure that it's not tampered with, and this is probably something that should be in the crisis plan, knowing where you're going to move it, or who's going to take care of it, because business has to go on, and you can't just have debris strewn about the parking lot for months and months and months. You have to get that developed. We've talked before, address the impact on human victims, or if it's an economic tragedy, and which of course is preferable to a human tragedy, how are you going to reach out to your customers, your suppliers, what have you, and let them know what's going on. We talk a little bit about litigation holds. I think most people on the phone are familiar with those, but you have to make sure that people lock down their documents right away, and that's why we said in an earlier slide, have those litigation holds pretty much pre-drafted just to be filled in on the particulars. And Jocelyn, it looks like you've got something to add on this.
I'd like to just add a follow-on to locking down your documents, which in this day and age means locking down your data. As part of this, you may have to bring in a vendor almost immediately to start imaging desktops and laptops. Know who you're going to use. Know who you're going to reach out to, because when that call comes from the regulatory body, and it could either be under law, or perhaps you entered into a contract with a public authority that under that contract there's a provision that says you have to turn over all of your data in a time of crisis, and those provisions are there. You're not going to have a lot of time to think about who should we use for bringing in to image our computers, and understanding and having your employees understand that all of a sudden we're going to lock down your entire computer.
Right. And Bob, maybe talk a little bit. You're not just talking to the media. What else are you up to?
Well, you got to talk to your employees. You got to make sure that your employees are up to date. If you ever go public to the media, you should have someone speaking to your folks internally at the same time or even before. It's the idea of it's family business. Let's hear about it. before. You don't want your employees hearing it through outside channels. It fosters goodwill for all the reasons we've talked about. You're talking to the government officials. You know what? If you're in a community and you've got real strong local support, which we hope you do, you're ambassadors for your company, everyone in town knows you, the mayor, the council, people that matter. Call them. Say, hey, give me a heads up. Hey, I just want you to know we got something bad happening, and we respect your support. Hope that you'll give us some support as we go through these difficult times. Hearing it on the street is not a good thing, so reaching out to folks. Social media is a topic we could go on for days and days and days. Engage social media. This slide is it's basically a compilation of all of the things that can happen. This is based on some research that was done on some major global events. This is how fast it goes. In a big global crisis, you could have as many as 34, 35 million tweets in 1 hour. It just goes that fast. Communicating, being ready to communicate quickly is really, really important. Having a social media policy in place for your employees, what you can, what you cannot do, is critically important moving forward. Having a communications response. Are we going to try to catch every snowflake in the snowstorm of social media? No. What are the channels you're going to use? And stick with that. Bring things offline. Social media is nothing more than a channel of communication, but it's a very important channel of communication.
All right. We talked about reaching out to folks, the government officials. If you're a public company, obviously you want to reach out to shareholders, board members are going to be important, and it needs to be a coordinated response. So we have just a few more minutes left, so I wanted to wrap it up by mentioning thanking everyone for participating in this, some of the resources that are available. Both Dorsey and PadillaCRT have numerous resources to help those preparing for a crisis, and these are free resources that people can take advantage of. My partner, Melissa Krasnow, for example, has just published guidance for responding to cyber incidents, which talks about some of the things that have to be done in the case of a cyber attack. Bob and PadillaCRT are just coming out with a new product, as I understand it, a scorecard of 15 to 18 questions to help companies kind of do a self-assessment of their preparedness for crisis, which is really terrific. Both Dorsey and PadillaCRT routinely do crisis audits and can help all of you with that if it's necessary. If you go to Dorsey.com, you can get far more information about these products. And if you have additional questions, I realize we've run up to the limit of our 90 minutes, but our group would love to answer your questions. So again, if you have those questions, send them to DorseyU@Dorsey.com, and we'll be happy to answer them. And finally, here is the information that we have on our contacts. Feel free to call any of us or email any of us. We'd be delighted to follow up with you on a one-on-one basis if we didn't answer your questions today, or if you have questions in the coming days or weeks. Bob and Jocelyn, thank you so much for participating. It's been a real pleasure. It's been a lot of fun.
Thank you.
And for those of you listening and watching in, I hope you've enjoyed this and have learned something along the way.